My name is Cameron, and I finally did it. Those words still ring within me like a prayer, like a confession of how I persevered, how I made it through all those long years of trials, reminding myself every day that my life was worth living, that there was a purpose ahead. After living like a monk for almost 8 years, depriving myself of everything others called joy, I bought my own house. For 8 years straight, I said no to all temptations. No new clothes, no movies, no random trips to a restaurant, no trips to the sea or the mountains, no vacations at all. While my friends were posting their tanned legs on white sand on Instagram and bragging about cocktails with umbrellas against the sunset, I was sitting in my cramped apartment with a cup of cheap noodles, proud of the fact that I'd managed to find another decent sweater at the thrift store for $3. It wasn't easy, watching life slip away, but I knew what I was doing it all for. The house isn't a palace, not a villa with columns, but it's mine. Mine alone. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with space for more than just pots and pans, and a living room that finally fits more than just an old sofa and a tiny table. When I first walked through this house, already holding the signed papers, I could barely breathe from the overwhelming emotion, and tears rolled down my cheeks, because it was a victory, my personal victory. The previous owners clearly loved this place. Fresh paint on the walls, a neat courtyard, everything was well kept. Nothing needed urgent repairs, and it was so surprisingly easy. Just move in and feel at home. For the first week, like a child let loose in a toy store for the first time, I ran around furniture stores and electronics shops. I was still cautious with money. The habit of saving felt like a second skin, but I allowed myself small joys. A sofa that didn't leave bruises on my back, a dining table that could seat more than 2 people, a washer and dryer that wouldn't break after a week. I chose all of these as if they were expensive gifts to myself. Every purchase turned into a celebration, like Christmas was back on the calendar, unpacking boxes of long-awaited surprises. I spent 2 weeks tidying everything up, filling the rooms with my breath and footsteps, and at some point, I realized it's time to celebrate. Housewarming. The word always sounded foreign to me because I'd never had a home I wanted to invite guests to, never had a space I wanted to warm. And now I had that chance, and I made a list of those I wanted to have around. Friends from work, college buddies, a few neighbors with whom I'd managed to exchange a few words, and of course, my family. I wrote to my parents first. They live just an hour's drive from here, in a small house that's been in dire need of repair for a while now. My father has been promising to fix the roof himself for 3 years now, but he never finds the time or energy, and my mother and I just shake our heads every time the topic of yet another leak comes up. My mother is always grumbling that her kitchen is too small, and every time I visit, she complains about how she has no room to move around with her pots and pans. It's true that I rarely visit them lately. Work, fatigue, and our relationship isn't always easy. Then I wrote to my sister, Sarah. She's only 4 years older than me, but sometimes it feels like we're from different worlds. She's divorced with 3 children, whom, despite their noise and endless whims, I love with all my heart. Emma, Jake, and little Lucy, they're between 7 and 10, and every meeting with them turns into a carousel of laughter, tears, and constant, "Aunt Cameron, can I?" Sarah lives in a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, and although her ex-husband pays generous child support, she only works part-time and almost always complains that she's tired, that the kids are wearing her out. My message was short and simple, but it meant the world to me. "Hi everyone, I have great news. I bought a house. The housewarming party is in 2 weeks. Here's the address. I hope you can come. I can't wait to show you around." I hit send and held my breath, staring at the phone, expecting it to ring at that very moment. I expected my mom to call right away to ask 1,000 questions about the house, the neighborhood, the price, whether I'd have enough money. I expected Sarah to start asking about the bedrooms, whether it would be comfortable for the kids to come over, and whether there were any good schools nearby. I imagined my father inquiring about the garage and the yard, but Nothing. Radio silence. 20 minutes later, the phone rang, but it wasn't Mom or Sarah. My friend Jessica, barely hearing my voice, screamed, "Cameron, oh my God, you bought a house. Tell me everything now. How many bedrooms? Is there a pool? What's the neighborhood?" We laughed over each other, and for the first time that day, I felt heard. My coworker Mike replied an hour later, dryly but sincerely, "Congratulations. I knew your savings would pay off. I can't wait to see your house." And nothing from my family. Not a word, not a sign. I checked my screen over and over again, wondering if maybe I'd missed a call or if my messages had gotten lost somewhere. I made up excuses. Maybe the phones were dead, maybe they were busy, maybe... But deep down, I already felt like this silence was no accident. But the days passed, and nothing happened, and the longer this deafening silence dragged on, the heavier it became inside, because I couldn't shake the thought that perhaps my message had simply gotten lost in the flow of their activities, or perhaps even gone unread, though my heart whispered they'd read it and simply didn't think it necessary to respond. No questions, no excitement, not a single, "We're so happy for you." It was as if I'd never sent anything. I tried not to dwell on it because my celebration was coming up, my first real celebration in my new home, and I decided to put my whole heart into it. I spent days preparing the house for the party as if I were hosting the entire world, and every little detail mattered. I ordered food from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown, 3 huge trays of pasta, a fresh salad, enough crusty bread for 20 people, and a dessert that was a feast in itself. Tiramisu with dark cocoa and delicate cream. I bought drinks, hung decorations, cleared away unnecessary items so that every room would breathe light and warmth, and meticulously checked to make sure not a speck of dust remained. My friends called and texted, some offering to bring flowers, others asking what to bring with wine, still others wanting to know when it would be convenient to visit. And each message was like a breath of fresh air, because their concern made the family's silence seem less stifling. I even consoled myself with the thought that maybe they were planning some kind of surprise. Maybe they weren't writing on purpose so they could all come over later, hug me and see everything with their own eyes, because deep down I still clung to the hope that they couldn't just ignore my most important day. The night before the party, I barely slept a wink. I wandered from room to room, straightening pillows, wiping tables, laying out napkins, and every corner of my new home seemed like a treasure I had to show everyone. This was my first real achievement in my adult life, and I was going to share it with those who mattered to me. The morning of the housewarming party arrived faster than I expected. I woke up before it was even light, at 6 in the morning, and my heart was pounding so hard I could almost hear it in my temples. I rushed around the house all day like a madwoman, checking and rechecking every little thing. I vacuumed every room twice, even though there wasn't a speck of dust in them, rearranged the throw pillows on the new sofa over and over, trying to find the perfect spot for them, and checked every bathroom to make sure they were stocked with fresh towels and lavender-scented soap. When the delivery guy brought the food, I felt a sense of relief. 3 trays of golden pasta, a Caesar salad, garlic bread that instantly filled the house with its aroma, and a tiramisu, which I placed in the center of the table as a centerpiece. I set everything out on the large dining table, and every time I looked at it, I couldn't believe it was my table. My plates from a real department store, my wine glasses, identical and made of crystal, not the cheap paper cups I'd been using for almost a decade, skimping on everything. Everything looked like something out of a magazine. The light-filled house, the food, the table setting, every detail seemed to emphasize that I'd earned this moment. The first guests began to arrive around 6. Jessica, as always, arrived first, beaming with a smile and clutching a bottle of expensive wine. "Cameron, this place is absolutely stunning. I can't believe you actually did this," she said, hugging me and immediately launching into a tour of the house, touching every surface as if checking if it was real. "Look at these floors, and these crown moldings. Girl, you really did this." Mike arrived right behind her with his girlfriend, a different Sarah, not my sister. They wandered around the house for a long time, examining every cabinet, every corner. "The light in the kitchen is incredible," Sarah enthused, opening and closing doors as if it weren't enough for her to just see them. She needed to touch them. "And the backyard! We could have barbecues there, Cameron. You have to do that this summer. Maybe you'll even get a pool someday." They were so sincere that I felt a warmth inside with each sentence, and I smiled as I talked about the mortgage, the house hunt, the neighbors, who seemed friendly so far. A little later, Tom, an old friend of mine from college, arrived with his wife and child. They brought a gift, carefully wrapped in silver paper, and Tom hugged me and said, "Cameron, I remember when you first started saving. You ate 99-cent frozen dinners every night to save up. Now look at you." His words pierced me, because I realized they saw what I'd been through. They knew the value of this house. An hour later, my house was filled with laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, and joyful voices. People complimented everything, from the hardwood floors I'd walked on alone so many times to the way I'd arranged the furniture. Each compliment fell softly and carefully into my heart, and I tried to soak up all the warmth, because that's why I opened the doors, to feel like my home had truly come to life. The living room buzzed with conversation, people arguing about the best paint colors for the walls, telling stories about their first mortgage payments, sharing funny stories with neighbors. Amidst all this noise, I felt my home fill with life, as if it had finally come alive, no longer just a space with furniture, but a real place to laugh, rejoice, and feel part of something. I stood aside, watching my friends relax on the sofa, sample food, compliment my wine selection, and laugh at each other's jokes. A rare and welcome warmth filled my chest because I saw that people were truly happy in the place I had created with my own hands and my perseverance. But all this radiance couldn't fill the void. There was still no family. I sneaked glances at my phone every few minutes, checking the screen in hopes of seeing at least one notification, one explanation that they were running late, that they'd be here any minute. But there was nothing. No calls, no messages, no hint that they remembered me. I tried not to show this growing despair on my face, smiling at my friends, nodding at their stories, but inside, something trembled, as if a thin thread was about to snap. I made up excuses to pass by the window, pretending to adjust the curtain or put a glass on the windowsill, but in reality, I was hoping to see the headlights of their car, their silhouettes at the gate, and each time, seeing no one, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Around 7:30, just when I was beginning to seriously think they wouldn't arrive and my entire wait would be in vain, a car door slammed outside. I froze, then rushed to the window and saw my parents walking up the path to the house, followed by Sarah and her 3 children, who, as usual, were jumping over rocks and trying to catch up with each other. My heart sank. With relief, with joy, with excitement, and without waiting for them to arrive, I rushed to the door, threw it open, and practically jumped with joy. "Mom, Dad, Sarah, you made it!" I was starting to worry. But something went wrong at that very second. All the energy that had filled me vanished. Mom barely glanced at me, nodded curtly, not bothering to smile, and said only my name in a cold voice, as if that was enough of a greeting. Dad stepped toward me and hugged me, but his arms were stiff, his movements tense, as if he were fulfilling a duty, checking off a to-do list, and immediately pulling away. Sarah, without looking me in the eye, led the children into the living room, muttering only, "Behave," as if I wasn't even standing there, expecting joy from her arrival. I tried to maintain a thin layer of enthusiasm on my face and said, "I'm so glad you're here. Come on, I'll show you everything." But Mom and Dad exchanged a quick glance that carried more meaning than any words, and Mom, without softening for a moment, said, "We'll see later." We stood there for a few seconds in that tense silence, and I felt my palms sweat with awkwardness. Meanwhile, Sarah sat the children down on the sofa and went upstairs, saying only, I'm going to have a look around." I watched her disappear down the stairs, while my parents remained in the living room, sitting on chairs in silence, barely engaging in conversation with my friends, and the silence around them was heavier than any reproach. 20 minutes later, Sarah came downstairs, walked straight up to Mom and Dad, and whispered something in their ears. And for the first time all evening, I saw their faces change, their lips curl into a smile, but they weren't smiling at me. Not at the house, not at my accomplishment. They were smiling at something Sarah had whispered, and their expressions were content, almost smug. I stood to the side, feeling a knot in my stomach, and at that moment Tom stood up with a glass of wine and said loudly, "I think it's time for a toast. Cameron, this is your moment." People gathered around, and even my grandmother, my father's mother, joined the circle. She was always reserved, but she was the first to raise her glass and say, "I'm so proud of Cameron." She worked harder than any of us to make this dream a reality. This house is proof that determination always pays off. The room erupted in applause and cheers. People clinked glasses and laughed, and Jessica continued, telling me how inspiring it was to watch me stick to my savings plan every day. Mike added that he'd never seen anyone with such a work ethic and that I deserved this success completely. I listened, feeling tears welling up in my eyes because everything I heard was genuine recognition, genuine support, and I wanted to hug them all, every single one of them who believed in me. And then, at that moment, when the room was filled with light and warmth, my mother cleared her throat and stood up. In an instant, the noise died down, all eyes turned to her, and I smiled, expecting to finally hear the words I'd been waiting for. But her eyes bored into mine with an expression bordering on anger, and her voice was sharp and clear. "Cameron has nothing to congratulate," she said, and the air seemed to drain from the room. "She's been irresponsible and selfish." A deathly silence fell over the room, so thick and heavy that I felt as if there wasn't a drop of oxygen left in the air, and I simply couldn't breathe. I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach, so hard and unexpected that I didn't even immediately realize what had happened. I stood in front of all these people, my friends, my neighbors, my relatives among them, and listened to my mother's voice, who, without the slightest hesitation, spoke aloud the words that made my heart clench. Instead of rejoicing with me, instead of supporting me, she said with cold certainty that I had done wrong, that I should have given the house to Sarah, since she had 3 children, and I, as she emphasized, was enjoying it alone, as if I had taken away someone's right to happiness. Her voice grew louder and sharper. Each word fell like a stone, and the people around her fell silent, listening to her. "Sarah is fighting for her children's happiness. She's exhausted," my mother said, and at that moment it seemed to me that she was no longer my mother, but a stern judge passing judgment. "And Cameron gets everything easy." I couldn't believe my ears. For all 8 years, while I had been saving every penny, denying myself vacations, clothes, pleasures, I kept hearing, "You need to think about the future." And I thought. I'd built this future step by step, and now, at the moment when I could finally be proud of the result, they told me it all didn't matter. My mother's voice wavered, and tears welled in her eyes, making her words even more painful, because they now sounded not just like a reproach, but like a true tragedy. "Sarah deserves this house more than Cameron," she said, and at that moment, as if on cue, Sarah walked up to the children and theatrically hugged them, holding them close, as if I posed some kind of threat, as if I could deprive them of a roof over their heads. The children looked confused, unsure why this was happening, but sensing their mother's gaze, they played along, hiding in her arms. And the scene seemed so implausible that it took my breath away. I couldn't utter a word. I couldn't even think. My head was filled with a buzzing noise, and every movement seemed impossible. This was supposed to be my celebration, my night, the moment I'd been working toward for 8 long years. But now my mother's voice echoed in my own living room, insisting to everyone that I was unworthy of what I'd lived for so long. And suddenly, my Aunt Carol, my mother's cousin, always loud and always keen to get her say in, stood up. She raised her hand and pointing directly at me said, "You know what? Linda's right. Cameron, you should think twice about giving this house to your sister. These kids need more space than you do." The words cut me, and I felt a hot wave rush across my cheeks, as if I'd been slapped again, this time in front of everyone. But then my grandmother, who had been sitting silently and watching, stood up decisively. "Absolutely not," her voice rang out, firm and clear, and it held so much power that for the first time that evening, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Cameron deserved this house. She doesn't have to give it up to anyone. These words sparked a fire, and chaos erupted. Half the room raised its voices in support of Mom and Aunt Carol, repeating something about poor kids, about family coming first, about how I had to compromise for the greater good. The other half wouldn't stand for it and loudly defended me, declaring that this was my choice, my life, and my home. Jessica, shaking with anger, practically screamed at my aunt, repeating, "Cameron saved for 8 years. 8 years. It's crazy to expect her to give it all up." Mike got into an argument with some distant cousin I barely knew, arguing that this wasn't about family obligations, but about fairness, about how you can't demand sacrifice just because someone feels more in need. Amidst all this squabbling, amid the din of voices, shouts, and heated exchanges, I noticed Mom, Dad, and Sarah exchange glances of satisfaction, as if that was exactly what they'd been hoping for. Then Mom feigned a heavy sigh, paused for everyone to catch her eye, and said dramatically, "We don't want to ruin Cameron's party. We have to go." Their gesture seemed deliberately noble, but in reality it was another blow. They gathered the children and, without a word to me, without so much as a parting glance, left, leaving behind a room full of arguing people. The voices continued to echo, arguing for another 20 minutes, waving their arms, arguing with one another, but I barely heard them. Gradually, the guests began to disperse in groups, continuing to heatedly discuss what had just happened, even on the threshold, at the door, by the car. I stood in my house, which suddenly seemed too big and cold, and looked at the mess left behind by what should have been the happiest evening of my life. Half-eaten plates of pasta were cooling on the tables. Glasses with the remains of wine were abandoned on the windowsills and on the floor. Crumpled napkins were strewn everywhere. The silence that returned after all the shouting and arguing was deafening, as if it were pressing me into the floor, and I felt everything inside me shrink. I began mechanically cleaning, picking up napkins, collecting glasses, stacking plates, but only one thought remained in my head. My own mother was standing in my living room, telling everyone that I didn't deserve my home, and my sister examined every room so carefully as if she was already imagining how she would live there. And the worst part was, half my guests agreed with them. As I loaded the dishwasher, my hands automatically performed their usual movements, but something inside me felt like it was cracking and crumbling, and memories came flooding back with such force that I couldn't shake them off or stop them. I thought back to all those years when I considered myself a good daughter and sister, when I supported my family financially, thinking that by doing so I demonstrated my love, my devotion, and my willingness to always be there. 3 years ago, when my mother called me late at night, sobbing and begging for help with the mortgage, I, without a second thought, transferred her $1,500 straight from my housing fund, the very same one I'd slowly saved, penny by penny, for this dream. When my father needed money for car repairs, I dug into my savings again and gave them $800. And when Sarah's divorce was underway and her lawyer needed a down payment, I gave them $5,000, ignoring the fact that I'd be living on frozen dinners and packaged soups for a week. I always helped. Whenever they asked, I found a way, even when I was struggling. Emergencies, repairs, medical bills, legal fees. I was their quiet, reliable lifeline. But as I closed the dishwasher and allowed myself to lean against the counter for a moment, a simple, bitter thought struck me. Did they ever celebrate my successes? Did they ever rejoice in my accomplishments? Were they truly proud of them, as I was proud of them, even in their small victories? This evening showed me the truth more clearly than any mirror. To them, I was not a person, not a daughter, not a sister. I was an ATM with a face and hands. I finished cleaning, exhausted beyond words, and went to the bedroom, hoping to at least fall asleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, my mother's voice floated through the stillness of the night, cold and accusing. Cameron has nothing to congratulate. Those words seemed to be etched into my bones, etched into my skin, and impossible to shake. And when the phone rang at precisely 8 in the morning, I was still lying in bed, my head heavy, feeling broken. Without looking at the number, I grabbed the receiver, and my mother's voice, so clear, businesslike, and utterly devoid of warmth, struck my ears. No greeting, no apology for ruining my housewarming, not the slightest hint of regret. "Have you thought about what we discussed yesterday?" she asked, as if we were talking about buying a new carpet and not about my life. "When are you going to give the house to Sarah?" I froze, incredulous. "Mom, you ruined my housewarming party. You embarrassed me in front of all my friends, and now you're calling to demand that I give up my house?" The response was calm, almost icy. "Don't be dramatic, Cameron. We're talking about what's right. Sarah has 3 children who need their own space, and you're just one, living alone in this huge house. It's selfish." I felt my voice tremble with rage. Selfish? I worked for this house for 8 years. 8 years, Mom. I saved every penny while Sarah was collecting child support and working part-time. This is my home, my life. But Mom, as if she hadn't heard, said coldly, "You'll change your mind. You'll understand that family is more important than your selfish desires." And she hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, shaking with anger like electricity was coursing through my veins. No apology. No acknowledgement that she'd done wrong, only demands, only accusations, and all of it delivered in a voice that oozed self-righteousness. Several days passed, and the situation not only didn't subside, but got much worse. Jessica called me directly at work, her voice sharp, full of anger and anxiety. "Cameron, have you seen your mother's post on Facebook?" she asked. "What post?" I asked, my heart sinking. "You need to look at it right now. I can't believe she did that." With trembling fingers, I opened my phone and logged into Facebook. My feed hadn't even had time to refresh before I saw my mother's post. The first thing I was struck by was the photos. Photos of Sarah's apartment taken by dim lamplight showed cluttered rooms with things piled high and toys strewn everywhere, creating a sense of chaos and poverty. In every frame, her children looked tired, their eyes dull, as if life itself were squeezing the energy out of them. Then came photos of my house, taken at a housewarming party. Bright, airy rooms, tables with beautifully laid out food, guests with glasses of wine, and myself, raising a glass and smiling, as if the world had finally become a kinder place. And the caption I saw beneath this contrast made me cringe in pain. While some people selfishly celebrate in their large, empty houses, my daughter Sarah struggles to provide for her 3 beautiful children in cramped circumstances. My heart breaks when I see my grandchildren suffering, while their aunt thinks only of herself. Sarah works so hard and deserves better. Some people get what they deserve, while others struggle to survive. I scrolled down and saw dozens of comments, some sympathetic to Sarah, others condemning me, and every word struck me straight in the heart. Relatives I barely remembered from rare family gatherings suddenly began appearing on my phone, as if awakened from years of slumber, each feeling obligated to leave a comment, a jab, or a judgment. The messages and calls echoed the same sentiments. Cameron should be ashamed. These poor kids deserve better. Family comes first. Even Aunt Carol, the one who always liked to maintain a proper and wise face, wrote a long comment, full of moralizing about how I should do the right thing and help my sister, as if she'd forgotten how many times I'd already helped Sarah out of her own mistakes. But I knew the truth, having been to Sarah's apartment dozens of times. It wasn't a palace, but a decent, clean place in a good neighborhood where the children had everything they needed. If the rooms looked cluttered in the photos, it was because they'd been playing all day, and Sarah had deliberately snapped the photo when toys were scattered everywhere to create a pitiful image. It was staged, a cheap manipulation, calculated to appeal to those who would believe the first impression. My phone never stopped ringing. It rang, shook, and vibrated with an endless stream of calls and messages. Relatives I hadn't seen in years suddenly resurfaced to lecture me on family responsibility. Cousin Jenny, whom I last saw at her own wedding 10 years ago, called in tears and begged me not to break up the family. Uncle Bob left a long voicemail, sighing as he told me I'd disappointed everyone and needed to fix everything. At some point, I simply stopped answering, put my phone on silent, and seriously considered changing my number just to make it stop. And then, amidst all this chaos, a voice I didn't expect to hear rang out. Grandma. Cameron, honey, can you come over? I think we need to talk. She still lived in the same house where she'd raised her father. She was 82, and although she could have long ago moved in with a relative, she still maintained a cheerful demeanor and managed everything herself. I went to see her, feeling defeated, as if all these days had turned me into a little girl, seeking protection once again. As soon as I walked into the house, my grandmother looked at my face and immediately hugged me tightly. Her embrace was warm, secure, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. Sit down, dear. Tell me what's going on, she said softly, and I couldn't resist pulling out my phone and showing her that very same Facebook post my mother had made. She didn't use the internet often, so she had no idea about all this scandal and the storm of comments. Grandma stared at the photographs for a long time, flipping through them with her leisurely movements, then looked up and at me with a gaze that held both compassion and firmness. This is wrong, Cameron. What your mother is doing is manipulation, plain and simple. I felt my hands shaking and quietly said, Grandma, I think I'm going crazy. Half the family thinks I should just give up everything I've worked for. She sighed and, lowering her eyes slightly, added, Your parents asked me to talk to you. They thought I could convince you to give the house to Sarah. My heart sank so hard I almost cried right there in front of her. Even Grandma? But then she suddenly smiled and said firmly, I told them no. You deserve this house, Cameron. You sacrificed for 8 years while Sarah lived comfortably on child support. You don't owe anyone your home. I exhaled, but my mother's words about family coming first still echoed in my head. But Mom says family is the most important thing, I whispered. Grandma raised a finger and said, Families are supposed to support each other, not humiliate each other. What your mother did at the party and that post online, that's not family, that's bullying. She made tea, placed a mug with a thin crack along the rim in front of me, and we talked for 2 hours. She told me stories from her youth about how she worked 7 days a week, how she raised a family, how she never expected handouts from anyone. She reminded me of all the times I'd helped my family financially and asked a simple yet devastatingly accurate question. Have they ever helped you in return? Those words were like an eye-opener. Grandma looked straight into mine and said, You're not selfish for keeping what you've earned, Cameron. You don't have to solve other people's problems. Sarah chose to have 3 children. Sarah chose to work part-time. Those were her decisions, not yours. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. Someone understood me. Someone had finally taken my side, and it wasn't just anyone. It was my grandmother. Don't let them intimidate you into giving up on your dreams, she said as I was about to leave. Stand your ground and everything will work out. I drove home through the evening streets, and for the first time since that ill-fated party, I felt calm. Grandma was right. I had worked too long and too hard to let anyone take my home from me. A few days after my conversation with my grandmother, I finally felt like I was getting back to my old self, as if the heavy weight that had been hanging over me all this time had finally begun to lift, and my breathing became easier and my thoughts clearer. The number of calls with reproaches and insults gradually decreased, and I decided to take a step that had previously seemed impossible. I simply blocked almost all the relatives who called to lecture and reproach me. I thought that perhaps peace was finally coming, that the storm had subsided, and I could continue my life the way I wanted. But just when I thought the worst was over, something happened that I least expected. On Saturday morning, there was a loud, insistent knock on the door. Sleepily, with a mug of coffee in hand, I approached the peephole and froze. Grandma was standing on the porch, and behind her were Mom, Dad, and Sarah. They all had such serious, tense expressions, as if they were about to hold some kind of official meeting, as if they had come together to pass judgment on me. My heart sank, and I felt a chill run through me. I reluctantly opened the door. "Grandma, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice firm even though I was shaking inside. "We need to have a serious talk, Cameron." "We're all in this together," Grandma said, her tone calm, but that only made me more anxious. I let them in, but my thoughts raced like birds in a cage. Why had Grandma brought them here? Had she changed her mind about supporting me? Was everything she'd said to me in that kitchen over a cup of tea really just empty words? We sat down at the dining room table, and my stomach clenched with worry. Mom and Dad looked smug, as if they knew they'd win. Sarah's eyes were openly sweeping around my house again, and that expression on her face, calculating, cold, as if she were trying out every room, was the same as the day I moved into my new home. I felt my heart pounding so loudly it seemed audible in the silence. Grandma cleared her throat, straightened up, and spoke. "I've been thinking about this situation all week and have made a serious decision." Mom immediately leaned forward, a greedy spark in her eyes. "Mom, we're so glad you finally realized it," she exclaimed impatiently. But Grandma didn't smile back. "I met with my lawyer yesterday," she continued, and the room grew so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. "I changed my will," Grandma said calmly. At that moment, Mom and Sarah perked up, and Dad smiled, as if he'd been waiting for this. I saw their faces light up with anticipation as they mentally divided up what they believed was rightfully theirs. They were certain Grandma would side with them and support their plan to take my house. "At first, I planned to leave everything to Robert," Grandma said, looking directly at my father, "so he could divide it fairly among his daughters." I saw Dad's eyes glint, and Mom's lips curled slightly, but Grandma continued. "But this whole situation has shown me that that would be deeply unfair." I watched the smiles begin to fade from my parents' faces. "I'm leaving my entire savings, almost $400,000, to Cameron," Grandma said firmly, her voice like a hammer blow, "and I'm dividing the house equally between Cameron and Sarah." A shadow flickered across Sarah's face. First it went chalk white, then it flushed with patches of red. "What? This isn't fair," she cried, her voice breaking. "Cameron already has a house, and I have children who need help." "Fair," her grandmother interrupted, her voice steely. "Cameron saved for 8 years to buy this house. She worked hard, made sacrifices, denied herself everything. And you live comfortably on child support and expect handouts from everyone." Mom jumped to her feet, her hands shaking, her voice full of anger. "Mom, you can't do this. Sarah needs this money much more than Cameron does. Cameron is being selfish, and you're rewarding her for it." "I reward hard work and responsibility," her grandmother replied calmly, looking her straight in the eye, "for what Cameron learned, and Sarah, apparently, didn't." Dad, who had been silent until then, finally intervened. "Mom, this isn't right. We're a family. We should share everything equally." Grandma narrowed her eyes. "Did you split the cost equally when you paid for Sarah's wedding, but didn't even help Cameron celebrate her college graduation? Did you split the cost equally when you spent 2 weeks with Sarah, helping with her baby, but couldn't spare even a weekend to help Cameron move into her first apartment?" A deathly silence fell over the room. I saw my parents freeze, stunned that Grandma had noticed their obvious favoritism, which they had so carefully denied all these years. Sarah buried her face in her hands and began to cry, but I knew they weren't real tears. It was the same game as the photos in her apartment. "Grandma, please think of your great-grandchildren," she said breathlessly. "They need stability. They need space. Cameron is just one person." Grandma raised her hand sharply, cutting her off. "Cameron has earned her place. And if you truly cared about your children's stability, you would stop this pathetic attempt to steal your sister's house and focus on improving your own situation." My mother's face grew increasingly red with each passing minute. Her breathing became ragged, and finally she shouted that if Grandma did this, if she followed through with her threats, she would destroy the family forever, as if forgetting that it was she who had first erected that impenetrable wall between us. Grandma smiled, but it wasn't a soft, gentle smile, but a cold, hard, almost iron one, the smile of someone tired of seeing injustice, and she uttered words that I knew would be etched in the memory of everyone present. "This family was already torn apart the moment you publicly humiliated Cameron and demanded that she give up everything she had worked for so many years. Now my only goal is to make sure you don't cause her any further harm." She stood up, rising from her chair with the confidence of one who stood before a judge, and looked straight at my mother, unblinking. "And if you don't delete that post where you made your daughter look like a monster by tomorrow morning and issue a public apology, I will change my will again, but this time so that everything, every penny, every item, every piece of property goes to Cameron." The words rang out like a death sentence. I saw my father swallow in confusion, Sarah cringe, and my mother momentarily speechless. The silence hung heavy, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. "You have until noon tomorrow to think and choose what's more important to you, pride or family," my grandmother added firmly. And then, with a strength surprising for someone her age, she pointed toward the front door. "Now get up and leave Cameron's house, and as you do, think carefully about how you want to proceed." Mom, Dad, and Sarah left without a word, their faces stunned and pale, as if the ground had slipped from under them. When the door slammed behind them, I ran to Grandma and hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Thank you," I whispered through sobs. "I can't believe you did that." Grandma stroked my hair and said in a tired but firm voice, "I should have done this years ago, dear. I've seen them treat you like nothing my whole life, and I couldn't take it anymore." The next morning, when I checked my phone over a cup of coffee, I saw that Mom's post had disappeared, and a new one had appeared on her page. The words were dry, as if scraped through clenched teeth. "I want to apologize to my daughter Cameron for the inappropriate comments I made about her house purchase. I was wrong, and I'm proud of her accomplishments." The lines seemed foreign, forced, but to me they meant one thing: grandmother's condition had been met. For the next week, the phone didn't stop ringing. My parents and Sarah called, leaving dozens of messages, sometimes begging me to talk to Grandma and convince her to change her will, sometimes breaking down into shouting and accusations. I didn't answer. I listened to the first few seconds, then simply deleted them all, and each time I felt another weight lifted from my shoulders. 4 months have passed since then. I still live in my house, and I love it more and more with each day. I decorated my rooms the way I'd dreamed of for years, invited friends over for dinner, laughed at the same table where they'd recently tried to humiliate me, and even planted a small garden in the backyard, where I now find solace in greenery and flowers every morning. My parents and Sarah gradually stopped making desperate attempts to reach out, though dry texts or voicemails still arrive from time to time, which I silently ignore. I realized that once I cut them out of my life, I could breathe easier. I felt happier and calmer than I had in years. Now my grandmother and I talk every week, and I've never been closer to her. She's become more than just a support system for me. She's a true anchor keeping me afloat, and I thank fate every day for her wisdom and strength. She was right. Everything worked out. I don't regret for a moment that I stood my ground. I worked for this house for 8 long years, counting every penny, denying myself many things, and no one had the right to take the fruits of my labor for someone else's convenience. For years, my family treated me like I was an ATM machine, not a daughter and sister. But now they know I won't let them take advantage of me anymore. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever be able to reconcile. But honestly, I'm not sure I want that. They showed me who they really are, and I believed them. And maybe that's why, for the first time in years, I feel better without those who see me only for what I can give them, not for who I really am.